Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 6. The Little House. Foolish Tootles was standing like a conqueror over Wendy's body when the other boys sprang armed from their trees. "You are too late," he cried proudly. "I have shot the Wendy. Peter will be so pleased with me." Overhead, Tinker Bell shouted, "Silly ass!" and darted into hiding. The others did not hear her. They had crowded round Wendy, and as they looked, a terrible silence fell upon the wood. If Wendy's heart had been beating, they would have all heard it. Slightly was the first to speak. "This is no bird," he said in a scared voice. "I think this must be a lady." "A lady," said Tootles, and fell a-trembling. "And we have killed her," Nibs said hoarsely. They all whipped off their caps. "Now I see," Curly said. "Peter was bringing her to us." He threw himself sorrowfully on the ground. "A lady to take care of us at last," said one of the twins, "and you have killed her." They were sorry for him, but sorrier for themselves, and when he took a step nearer, they turned from him. Tootles' face was very white, but there was a dignity about him, now that there never had been before. "I did it," he said, reflecting. "When ladies used to come to me in dreams, I always said, 'Pretty mother, pretty mother,' but when at last she really came, I shot her." He moved slowly away. "Don't go," they called in pity. "I must," he answered, shaking. "I am so afraid of Peter." It was at this tragic moment that they heard a sound which made the heart of every one of them rise to his mouth. They heard Peter crow. "Peter!" they cried, for it was always thus that he signaled his return. "Hide her!" they whispered, and gathered hastily around Wendy. But Tootles stood aloof. Again there came that ringing crow, and Peter dropped in front of them. "Greetings, boys!" he cried, and mechanically they saluted, and then again was silence. He frowned. "I am back," he said hotly. "Why do you not cheer?" They opened their mouths, but the cheers would not come. He overlooked it in his haste to tell the glorious tidings. "Great news, boys!" he cried. "I have brought at last a mother for you all." Still no sound except a little thud from Tootles as he dropped on his knees. "Have you not seen her?" asked Peter, becoming troubled. "She flew this way." "Ah, me," one voice said, and another said, "Oh, mournful day." Tootles rose. "Peter," he said quietly, "I will show her to you." And when the others would still have hidden her, he said, "Back, twins, let Peter see." So they all stood back and let him see, and after he had looked for a little time, he did not know what to do next. "She is dead," he said uncomfortably. "Perhaps she is frightened at being dead." He thought of hopping off in a comic sort of way till he was out of sight of her and then never going near the spot any more. They all would have been glad to follow him if he had done this. But there was the arrow. He took it from her heart and faced his band. "Whose arrow?" he demanded sternly. "Mine, Peter," said Tootles on his knees. "Oh, dastard hand," Peter said. And he raised the arrow to use it as a dagger. Tootles did not flinch. He bared his breast. "Strike, Peter," he said firmly. "Strike true." Twice did Peter raise the arrow, and twice did his hand fall. "I cannot strike," he said with awe. "There is something which stays my hand." All looked at him in wonder, save Nibs, who fortunately looked at Wendy. "It is she!" he cried. "The Wendy lady! See, her arm!" Wonderful to relate, Wendy had raised her arm. Nibs bent over her and listened reverently. "I think she said, 'Poor Tootles,'" he whispered. "She lives," Peter said, briefly. Slightly cried instantly, "The Wendy lady lives!" Then Peter knelt beside her and found his button. You remember she had placed it on the chain that she wore around her neck. "See," he said, "the arrow struck against this. It is the kiss I gave her. It has saved her life." "I remember kisses," Slightly interposed quickly. "Let me see it. Aye, there's a kiss." Peter did not hear him. He was begging Wendy to get better quickly so that he could show her the mermaids. Of course she could not answer yet, being still in a frightful faint, but from overhead came a wailing note. "Listen to Tink," said Curly. "She is crying because the Wendy lives." Then they had to tell Peter of Tink's crime, and almost never had they seen him look so stern. "Listen, Tinker Bell," he cried. "I am your friend no more. Begone from me forever." She flew onto his shoulder and pleaded, but he brushed her off. Not until Wendy raised her arm did he relent sufficiently to say, "Well, not forever, but for a whole week." Do you think that Tinker Bell was grateful to Wendy for raising her arm? Oh dear, no, never wanted to pinch her so much. Fairies are indeed strange, and Peter, who understood them best, often cuffed them. But what to do with Wendy in her present delicate state of health? "Let us carry her into the house," Curly suggested. "Aye," said Slightly, "that is what one does with ladies." "No, no," Peter said, "you must not touch her. It would not be sufficiently respectful." "That," said Slightly, "is what I was thinking. But if she lies there," Toodle said, "she will die." "Aye, she will die," Slightly admitted, "but there is no way out." "Yes, there is," cried Peter. "Let us build a little house round her." They were all delighted. "Quick," he ordered them. "Bring me, each of you, the best of what we have. Get out the house. Be sharp." In a moment they were as busy as tailors the night before a wedding. They scurried this way and that, down for bedding, up for firewood, and while they were at it, who should appear but John and Michael? As they dragged up along the ground, they fell asleep standing, stopped, woke up, moved another feet, and slept again. "John! John!" Michael would cry. "Wake up! Where is Nana, John, and Mother?" And then John would rub his eyes and mutter, "It is true. We did fly." You may be sure they were very relieved to find Peter. "Hello, Peter," they said. "Hello," replied Peter, amicably, though he had quite forgotten them. He was very busy at the moment, measuring Wendy with his feet to see how large a house she would need. Of course, he meant to leave room for chairs and a table. John and Michael watched him. "Is Wendy asleep?" they asked. "Yes." "John," Michael proposed, "let us wake her and get her to make supper for us." But as he said it, some of the other boys rushed on, carrying branches for building of the house. "Look at them," he cried. "Curly," said Peter, in his most captainly voice, "see that these boys help in the building of the house." "Aye, aye, sir." "Build a house?" exclaimed John. "For the Wendy," said Curly. "For Wendy?" John said, aghast. "Why, she is only a girl." "That," explained Curly, "is why we are her servants." "You? Wendy's servants?" "Yes," said Peter, "and you also. Away with them." The astounded brothers were dragged away to hack and hew and carry. "Chairs and a fender first," Peter ordered. "Then we shall build a house round them." "Aye," said Slightly, "that is how a house is built. It all comes back to me." Peter thought of everything. "Slightly," he cried, "fetch a doctor." "Aye, aye," said Slightly at once, and disappeared, scratching his head. But as he knew Peter must be obeyed, he returned in a moment, wearing John's hat and looking solemn. "Please, sir," said Peter, going to him, "are you a doctor?" The difference between him and the other boys at such a time was that they knew it was make-believe, while to him make-believe and true were exactly the same thing. This sometimes troubled them, as when they had to make believe that they had their dinners. If they broke down in their make-believe, he rapped them on the knuckles. "Yes, my little man," Slightly anxiously replied, who had chapped knuckles. "Please, sir," Peter explained, "a lady lies very ill." She was lying at their feet, but Slightly had the sense not to see her. He said, "Where does she lie?" "In yonder glade." "I will put a glass thing in her mouth," said Slightly, and he made believe to do it while Peter waited. It was an anxious moment when the glass thing was withdrawn. "How is she?" inquired Peter. Said Slightly, "This has cured her." "I am glad," said Peter. "I will call again in the evening," Slightly said. "Give her beef tea out of a cup with a spout to it." But after he had returned the hat to John, he blew big breaths, which was his habit on escaping from a difficulty. In the meantime, the wood had been alive with the sound of axes. Almost everything needed for a cozy dwelling already lay at Wendy's feet. "If we only knew," said one, "the kind of house she likes best." "Peter!" shouted another. "She is moving in her sleep." "Her mouth opens!" cried a third, looking respectfully into it. "Oh, lovely!" "Perhaps she's going to sing in her sleep," said Peter. "Wendy, sing the kind of house you would like to have." Immediately, without opening her eyes, Wendy began to sing.
I wish I had a pretty house, the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls and roof of mossy green. They gurgled with joy at this, for by the greatest good luck the branches they had brought were sticky with red sap, and all the ground was carpeted with moss. As they rattled up the little house, they broke into song themselves. "We've built the little walls and roof and made a lovely door, so tell us, Mother Wendy, what are you wanting more?" To this she answered greedily, Oh, really, next I think I'll have gay windows all about, with roses peeping in, you know, and babies peeping out. With a blow of their fist they made windows, and large yellow leaves were the blinds, but roses? Roses! Cried Peter, sternly. Quickly they made believe to grow the loveliest roses up the walls. Babies? To prevent Peter ordering babies, they hurried into song again. We've made the roses peeping out, the babes are at the door. We cannot make ourselves, you know, 'cause we've been made before. Peter, seeing this to be a good idea, at once pretended that it was his own. The house was quite beautiful, and no doubt Wendy was very cozy within, though of course they could no longer see her. Peter strode up and down, ordering finishing touches. Nothing escaped his eagle eyes. Just when it seemed absolutely finished, "There's no knocker on the door," he said. They were very ashamed, but Toodles gave the sole of his shoe, and it made an excellent knocker. Absolutely finished now, they thought. Not a bit of it. "There's no chimney," said Peter. "We must have a chimney." "It certainly does need a chimney," said John importantly. That gave Peter an idea. He snatched the hat off John's head, knocked out the bottom, and put the hat on the roof. The little house was so pleased to have such a capital chimney that, as if to say thank you, smoke immediately began to come out of the hat. Now, really and truly, it was finished. Nothing remained to do but to knock. "All look your best," Peter warned them. "First impressions are awfully important." He was glad no one asked him what first impressions are. They were all too busy looking their best. He knocked politely, and now the wood was as still as the children. Not a sound to be heard except from Tinker Bell, who was watching from a branch and openly sneering. What the boys was wondering was, would anyone answer the knock? If a lady, what would she be like? The door opened, and a lady came out. It was Wendy. They all whipped off their hats. She looked properly surprised, and this was just how they had hoped she would look. "Where am I?" she said. Of course, Slightly was the first to get his word in. "Wendy, lady," he said rapidly, "for you we built this house." "Oh, say you're pleased," cried Nibs. "Lovely, darling house," Wendy said, and they were the very words they had hoped she would say. "And we are your children," cried the twins. They all went on their knees, and holding out their arms, cried, "Oh, Wendy, lady, be our mother." "Ought I?" Wendy said, all shining. "Of course, it's frightfully fascinating, but you see, I'm only a little girl. I have no real experience." "That doesn't matter," said Peter, as if he were the only person present who knew at all about it, though he was really the one who knew least. "What we need is just a nice, motherly person." "Oh, dear," Wendy said. "You see, I feel that is exactly what I am." "It is! It is!" they all cried. "We saw it at once." "Very well," she said. "I will do my best. Come inside at once, you naughty children. I am sure your feet are damp, and before I put you to bed, I have just time to finish the story of Cinderella." In they went. I don't know how there was room for them, but you can squeeze very tight in Neverland. And that was the first of the many joyous evenings they had with Wendy. By and by she tucked them up in the great bed in the home under the trees, but she herself slept that night in the little house, and Peter kept watch outside with drawn sword, for the pirates could be heard carousing far away, and the wolves were on the prowl. The little house looked so cozy and safe in the darkness, with a bright light showing through its blinds, and the chimney smoking beautifully and Peter standing on guard. After a time he fell asleep, and some unsteady fairies had to climb over him on their way home from an orgy. Any of the other boys obstructing the fairy path at night they would have mischieved, but they just tweaked Peter's nose and passed on.
Chapter 7. The Home Under the Ground. One of the first things Peter did next day was to measure Wendy and John and Michael for hollow trees. Hook, you remember, had sneered at the boys for thinking they needed a tree apiece. But this was ignorance, for unless your tree fitted you, it was difficult to go up and down, and no two of the boys were quite the same size. Once you fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went at exactly the right speed, while to ascend you drew in and let out alternately, and so wriggled up. Of course, when you have mastered the action, you are able to do these things without thinking of them, and nothing can be more graceful. But you simply must fit, and Peter measures you for your tree as carefully as for a suit of clothes, the only difference being that the clothes are made to fit you, while you have to be made to fit the tree. Usually it is done quite easily, as by your wearing too many garments or too few. But if you are bumpy in awkward places, or the only available tree is an odd shape, Peter does some things to you, and after that you fit. Once you fit, great care must be taken to go on fitting, And this, as Wendy was to discover to her delight, keeps a whole family in perfect condition. Wendy and Michael fitted their trees at the first try, but John had to be altered a little. After a few days' practice, they could go up and down as gaily as buckets in a well. And how ardently they grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. It consisted of one large room, as all houses should do, with a floor in which you could dig if you wanted to go fishing, and in this floor grew stout mushrooms of a charming colour, which were used as stools. A never-tree tried hard to grow in the centre of the room, but every morning they sawed the trunk through level with the floor. By tea-time it was always about 2 feet high, and then they put a door on top of it, the whole thus becoming a table. As soon as they cleared away, they sawed off the trunk again, and thus there was more room to play. There was an enormous fireplace, which was in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it, and across this Wendy stretched strings, made of fibre, from which she suspended her washing. The bed was tilted against the wall by day, and let down at 6:30, when it filled nearly half the room, and all the boys slept in it except Michael, lying like sardines in a tin. There was a strict rule against turning round until one gave the signal, when all turned at once. Michael should have used it also, but Wendy would have a baby, and he was the littlest, and you know what women are, and the short and long of it is that he was hung up in a basket. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a bird-cage, which was the private apartment of Tinker Bell. It could be shut off from the rest of the house by a tiny curtain, which Tink, who was most fastidious, always kept drawn when dressing or undressing. No woman, however large, could have had a more exquisite boudoir and bedchamber combined. The couch, as she always called it, was a genuine Queen Mab with club legs, and she varied the bedspreads according to what fruit blossom was in season. Her mirror was a Puss in Boots, of which there are now only 3 unchipped known to fairy dealers. The washstand was pie crust and reversible. The chest of drawers an authentic Charming the 6th, and the carpet and rugs the best, the early period, of Marjorie and Robin. There was a chandelier from Tiddlywinks for the look of the thing, but of course she lit the residence herself. Tink was very contemptuous of the rest of the house, as indeed was perhaps inevitable, and her chamber, though beautiful, looked rather conceited, having the appearance of a nose permanently turned up. I suppose it was all especially entrancing to Wendy, because those rampageous boys of hers gave her so much to do. Really, there were whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, she was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept her nose to the pot, and even if there was nothing in it, even if there was no pot, she had to keep watching that it came a-boil just the same. You never exactly knew whether there would be a real meal or just a make-believe. It all depended upon Peter's whim. He could eat, really eat, if it was part of a game, but he could not stodge just to feel stodgy, which is what most children like better than anything else, the next best thing being to talk about it. Make-believe was so real to him that during a meal of it you could see him getting rounder. Of course it was trying, but you simply had to follow his lead, and if you could prove to him that you were getting loose for your tree, he let you stodge. Wendy's favorite time for sewing and darning was after they had all gone to bed. Then, as she expressed it, she had a breathing time for herself, and she occupied it in making new things for them and putting double pieces on the knees, for they were all most frightfully hard on their knees. When she sat down to a basket full of their stockings, every heel with a hole in it, she would fling up her arms and exclaim, "Oh dear, I am sure I sometimes think spinsters are to be envied." Her face beamed when she exclaimed this. You remember about her pet wolf? Well, it very soon discovered that she had come to the island, and it found her out, and they just ran into each other's arms. After that, it followed her about everywhere. As time wore on, did she think much about the beloved parents she had left behind her? This is a difficult question, because it is quite impossible to say how time does wear on in the Neverland, where it is calculated by moons and suns, and there are ever so many more of them than on the mainland. But I am afraid that Wendy did not really worry about her father and mother. She was absolutely confident that they would always keep the window open for her to fly back by, and this gave her complete ease of mind. What did disturb her at times was that John remembered his parents vaguely only, as people he had once known, while Michael was quite willing to believe that she was really his mother. These things scared her a little, and, nobly anxious to do her duty, she tried to fix the old life in their minds by setting them examination papers on it as like as possible to the ones she used to do at school. The other boys thought this awfully interesting, and insisted on joining, and they made slates for themselves and sat round the table, writing and thinking hard about the questions she had written on another slate and passed round. They were the most ordinary questions. What was the color of Mother's eyes? Which was taller, father or mother? Was Mother blonde or brunette? Answer all three questions if possible. A. Write an essay of not less than 40 words on How I Spent My Last Holidays, or The Characters of Father and Mother Compared, only one of these to be attempted. Or 1. Describe Mother's laugh. 2. Describe Father's laugh. 3. Describe Mother's party dress. 4. Describe the kennel and its inmate. They were just everyday questions like these, and when you could not answer them you were told to make a cross, and it was really dreadful what a number of crosses even John made. Of course, the only boy who replied to every question was Slightly, and no one could have been more hopeful of coming out first. But his answers were perfectly ridiculous, and he really came out last, a melancholy thing. Peter did not compete. For one thing, he despised all mothers except Wendy, and for another, he was the only boy on the island who could neither write nor spell, not the smallest word. He was above all that sort of thing. By the way, the questions were all written in the past tense. What was the color of Mother's eyes, and so on. Wendy, you see, had been forgetting too. Adventures, of course, as we shall see, were of daily occurrence, but about this time Peter invented, with Wendy's help, a new game that fascinated him enormously, until he suddenly had no more interest in it, which, as you have been told, was what always happened with his games. It consisted in pretending not to have adventures, in doing the sort of thing John and Michael had been doing all their lives, sitting on stools, flinging balls in the air, pushing each other, going out for walks and coming back without having killed so much as a grizzly. To see Peter doing nothing on a stool was a great sight. He could not help looking solemn at such times. To sit still seemed to him such a comic thing to do. He boasted that he had gone walking for the good of his health. For several sons, these were the most novel of all adventures to him, and John and Michael had to pretend to be delighted also, otherwise he would have treated them severely. He often went out alone, and when he came back you were never absolutely certain whether he had had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he said nothing about it, and then when you went out you found the body. And on the other hand, he might say a great deal about it, and yet you could not find the body. Sometimes he came home with his head bandaged, and then Wendy cooed over him and bathed it in lukewarm water, while he told a dazzling tale. But she was never quite sure, you know. There were, however, many adventures which she knew to be true, because she was in them herself, and there were still more that were at least partly true, for the other boys were in them and said they were wholly true. To describe them all would require a book as large as an English-Latin, Latin-English dictionary, and the most we can do is to give one as a specimen of an average hour on the island. The difficulty is which one to choose. Should we take the brush with the redskins at Slightly Gulch? It was a sanguinary affair, and especially interesting as showing one of Peter's peculiarities, which was that in the middle of a fight he would suddenly change sides. At the Gulch, when victory was still in the balance, sometimes leaning this way and sometimes that, he called out, "I'm Redskin today. What are you, Toodles?" And Toodles answered, "Redskin. What are you, Nibs?" And Nibs said, "Redskin. What are you, Twin?" And so on. And they were all Redskins. And of course this would have ended the fight had not the real Redskins, fascinated by Peter's methods, agreed to be lost boys for that once. And so at it they all went again, more fiercely than ever. The extraordinary upshot of this adventure was— But we have not decided yet that this is the adventure we are to narrate. Perhaps a better one would be the night attack by the Redskins on the house under the ground, when several of them stuck in the hollow trees and had to be pulled out like corks. Or we might tell how Peter saved Tiger Lily's life in the Mermaid's Lagoon, and so made her his ally. Or we could tell of that cake the pirates cooked, so that the boys might eat it and perish, and how they placed it in one cunning spot after another, but always Wendy snatched it from the hands of her children, so that in time it lost its succulence, and became as hard as a stone, and was used as a missile, and Hook fell over it in the dark. Or suppose we tell of the birds that were Peter's friends, particularly of the never-bird that built in a tree overhanging the lagoon, and how the nest fell into the water, and still the bird sat on her eggs, and Peter gave orders that she was not to be disturbed. That is a pretty story, and the end shows how grateful a bird can be. But if we tell it, we must also tell the whole adventure of the lagoon, which would, of course, be telling two adventures rather than just one. A shorter adventure, and quite as exciting, was Tinker Bell's attempt, with the help of some street fairies, to have the sleeping Wendy conveyed on a great floating leaf to the mainland. Fortunately, the leaf gave way, and Wendy woke, thinking it was bath time, and swam back. Or again, we might choose Peter's defiance of the lions, when he drew a circle round him on the ground with an arrow and dared them to cross it, and though he waited for hours, with the other boys and Wendy looking on breathlessly from trees, Not one of them dared to accept his challenge. Which of these adventures shall we choose? The best way will be to toss for it. I have tossed, and the lagoon has won. This almost makes one wish that the gulch, or the cake, or Tink's leaf had won. Of course I could do it again and make it the best out of 3. However, perhaps fairest to stick to the lagoon. End of Chapter 7 of Peter Pan.
Chapter 8. The Mermaid's Lagoon. If you shut your eyes and are a lucky one, you may see at times a shapeless pool of lovely pale colors suspended in the darkness. Then if you squeeze your eyes tighter, the pool begins to take shape, and the colors become so vivid that with another squeeze they must go on fire. But just before they go on fire, you see the lagoon. This is the nearest you ever get to it on the mainland, just one heavenly moment. If there could be 2 moments, you might see the surf and hear the mermaids singing. The children often spent long summer days on this lagoon, swimming or floating most of the time, playing the mermaid games in the water and so forth. You must not think from this that the mermaids were on friendly terms with them. On the contrary, it was among Wendy's lasting regrets that all the time she was on the island she never had a civil word from one of them. When she stole softly to the edge of the lagoon, she might see them by the score, especially on Marooner's Rock, where they loved to bask, combing out their hair in a lazy way that quite irritated her. Or she might even swim, on tiptoe as it were, to within a yard of them, but then they saw her and dived, probably splashing her with their tails, not by accident, but intentionally. They treated all the boys in the same way, except of course Peter, who chatted with them on Marooner's Rock by the hour, and sat on their tails when they got cheeky. He gave Wendy one of their combs. The most haunting time at which to see them is at the turn of the moon, when they utter strange wailing cries. But the lagoon is dangerous for mortals then, and until the evening of which we now have to tell, Wendy had never seen the lagoon by moonlight. Less from fear, for of course Peter would have accompanied her, than because she had strict rules about everyone being in bed by 7. She was often at the lagoon, however, on sunny days after rain, when the mermaids come up in extraordinary numbers to play with their bubbles. The bubbles of many colors made in the rainbow water they treat as balls, hitting them gaily from one to another with their tails, and trying to keep them in the rainbow until they burst. The goals are at each end of the rainbow, and the keepers only are allowed to use their hands. Sometimes a dozen of these games will be going on in the lagoon at a time, and it is quite a pretty sight. But the moment the children tried to join in, they had to play by themselves, for the mermaids immediately disappeared. Nevertheless, we have proof that they secretly watched the interlopers, and were not above taking an idea from them, for John introduced a new way of hitting the bubble, with the head instead of the hand, and the mermaids adopted it. This is the one mark that John has left on the Neverland. It must also have been rather pretty to see the children resting on a rock for half an hour after their midday meal. Wendy insisted on their doing this, and it had to be a real rest, even though the meal was make-believe. So they lay there in the sun, and their bodies glistened in it, while she sat beside them and looked important. It was one such day, and they were all on Marooner's Rock. The rock was not much larger than their great bed, but of course they all knew how not to take up much room, and they were dozing. Or at least lying with their eyes shut, and pinching occasionally when they thought Wendy was not looking. She was very busy stitching. While she stitched, a change came to the lagoon. Little shivers ran over it, and the sun went away, and shadows stole across the water, turning it cold. Wendy could no longer see to thread her needle, and when she looked up, the lagoon that had always hitherto been such a laughing place seemed formidable and unfriendly. It was not, she knew, that night had come, but something as dark as night had come. No, worse than that. It had not come, but it had sent that shiver through the sea to say that it was coming. What was it? There crowded upon her all the stories she had been told of Marooner's Rock, so called because evil captains put sailors on it and leave them there to drown. They drown when the tide rises, for then it is submerged. Of course she should have roused the children at once, not merely because of the unknown that was stalking towards them, but because it was no longer good for them to sleep on a rock grown chilly. But she was a young mother, and she did not know this. She thought you simply must stick to your rule about half an hour after the midday meal. So, though fear was upon her and she longed to hear male voices, she would not waken them. Even when she heard the sound of muffled oars, though her heart was in her mouth, she did not waken them. She stood over them to let them have their sleep out. Was it not brave of Wendy? It was well for those boys, then, that there was one among them who could sniff danger even in his sleep. Peter sprang erect, as wide awake at once as a dog, and with one warning cry he roused the others. He stood motionless, one hand to his ear. "Pirates!" he cried. The others came closer to him. A strange smile was playing about his face, and Wendy saw it and shuddered. While that smile was on his face, no one dared address him. All they could do was stand ready to obey. The order came sharp and incisive. "Dive!" There was a gleam of legs, and instantly the lagoon seemed deserted. Marooner's Rock stood alone in the forbidding waters, as if it were itself marooned. The boat drew nearer. It was the pirate dinghy, with 3 figures in her, Smee and Starkey, and the third a captive, no other than Tiger Lily. Her hands and ankles were tied, and she knew what was to be her fate. She was to be left on the rock to perish, an end to one of her race more terrible than death by fire or torture. For is it not written in the book of the tribe that there is no path through water to the happy hunting ground? Yet her face was impassive. She was the daughter of a chief. She must die as a chief's daughter. It is enough. They had caught her boarding the pirate ship with a knife in her mouth. No watch was kept on the ship, it being Hook's boast that the wind of his name guarded the ship for a mile around. Now her fate would help to guard it also. One more whale would go round in that wind by night. In the gloom that they brought with them, the 2 pirates did not see the rock till they crashed into it. "Luff, you lubber!" cried an Irish voice that was Smee's. "Here's the rock. Now then, what we have to do is hoist the redskin onto it and leave her here to drown." It was the work of one brutal moment to land the beautiful girl on the rock. She was too proud to offer a vain resistance. Quite near the rock, but out of sight, 2 heads were bobbing up and down, Peter's and Wendy's. Wendy was crying, for it was the first tragedy she had seen. Peter had seen many tragedies, but he had forgotten them all. He was less sorry than Wendy for Tiger Lily. It was 2 against 1 that angered him, and he meant to save her. An easy way would have been to wait until the pirates had gone, but he was never one to choose the easy way. There was almost nothing he could not do. He now imitated the voice of Hook. "Ahoy there, you lubbers!" he called. It was a marvelous imitation. "The captain!" said the pirates, staring at each other in surprise. "He must be swimming out to us," Starkey said, when they had looked for him in vain. "We are putting the redskin on the rock," Smee called out. "Set her free," came the astonishing answer. "Free?" "Yes. Cut her bonds and let her go." "But, Captain—" "At once, d'ye hear?" cried Peter, "or I'll plunge my hook into you." "This is queer," Smee gasped. "Better do what the captain orders," said Starkey nervously. "Aye, aye," Smee said, and he cut Tiger Lily's cords. At once, like an eel, she slid between Starkey's legs into the water. Of course, Wendy was very elated over Peter's cleverness, but she knew that he would be elated also, and very likely crow and thus betray himself, so at once her hand went out to cover his mouth. But it was stayed even in the act, for "Boat ahoy!" rang over the lagoon in Hook's voice, and this time it was not Peter who had spoken. Peter may have been about to crow, but his face puckered in a whistle of surprise instead. "Boat ahoy!" again came the voice. Now Wendy understood. The real Hook was also in the water. He was swimming to the boat, and as his men showed a light to guide him, he had soon reached them. In the light of the lantern, Wendy saw his hook grip the boat's side. She saw his evil, swarthy face as he rose dripping from the water, and, quaking, she would have liked to swim away, but Peter would not budge. He was tingling with life, and also top-heavy with conceit. "Am I not a wonder? "Oh, I am a wonder," he whispered to her, and though she thought so also, she was really glad for the sake of his reputation that no one heard him except himself. He signed to her to listen. The two pirates were very curious to know what had brought their captain to them, but he sat with his head on his hook in a position of profound melancholy. "Captain, is all well?" they asked timidly, but he answered with a hollow moan. "He sighs," said Smee. "He sighs again," said Starkey. "And yet a third time he sighs," said Smee. Then at last he spoke passionately. "The game's up," he cried. "Those boys have found a mother." Affrighted though she was, Wendy swelled with pride. "Oh, evil day!" cried Starkey. "What's a mother?" asked the ignorant Smee. Wendy was so shocked that she exclaimed, "He doesn't know?" And always after this she felt that if you could have a pet pirate, Smee would be her one. Peter pulled her beneath the water, for Hook had started up, crying, "What was that?" "I heard nothing," said Starkey, raising the lantern over the waters, and as the pirates looked, they saw a strange sight. It was the nest I have told you of, floating on the lagoon, and the Never-bird was sitting on it. "See," said Hook in answer to Smee's question, "that is a mother. What a lesson! The nest must have fallen into the water, but would the mother desert her eggs? No." There was a break in his voice, as if for a moment he recalled innocent days when... But he brushed away this weakness with his hook. Smee, much impressed, gazed at the bird as the nest was borne past, but the more suspicious Starkey said, "If she's a mother, perhaps she's hanging about here to help Peter." Hook winced. "Aye," he said, "that is the fear that haunts me." He was roused from this dejection by Smee's eager voice. "Captain," said Smee, "could we not kidnap these boys' mother, and make her our mother?" "It is a princely scheme," cried Hook, and at once it took practical shape in his great brain. "We will seize the children, and carry them to the boat. The boys we will make walk the plank, and Wendy shall be our mother." Again Wendy forgot herself. "Never!" she cried, and bobbed. What was that? But they could see nothing. They thought it must have been a leaf in the wind. "Do you agree, my bullies?" asked Hook. "There's my hand on it," they both said, "and there's my hook. Swear." They all swore. By this time they were on the rock, and suddenly Hook remembered Tiger Lily. "Where's the redskin?" he demanded abruptly. He had a playful humor at moments, and they thought this was one of the moments. "That's all right, Captain," Smee answered complacently. "We let her go." "Let her go?" cried Hook. "'Twas your own orders," the boatswain faltered.
"You called over the water to us to let her go," said Starkey.
"Brimstone and gall!" thundered Hook. "What cozening is going on here?" His face had gone black with rage, but he saw that they believed their words, and he was startled. "Lads," he said, shaking a little, "I gave no such order." "It is passing queer," Smee said, and they all fidgeted uncomfortably. Hook raised his voice, but there was a quiver in it. "Spirit that haunts this dark lagoon tonight," he cried, "dost hear me?" Of course Peter should have kept quiet, but of course he did not. He immediately answered in Hook's voice. "Odds, bobs, hangmer and tongs, I hear you." In that supreme moment, Hook did not blanch, even at the gills, but Smee and Starkey clung to each other in terror. "Who are you, stranger? Speak," Hook demanded. "I am James Hook," replied the voice, "captain of the Jolly Roger." "You are not! You are not!" Hook cried hoarsely. "Brimstone and gall," the voice retorted. "Say that again, and I'll cast anchor in you." Hook tried a more ingratiating manner. "If you are Hook," he said almost humbly, "come tell me, who am I?" "A codfish," replied the voice. "Only a codfish."
"A codfish,"
Hook echoed blankly, and it was then, but not till then, that his proud spirit broke. He saw his men draw back from him. "Have we been captained all this time by a codfish?" they muttered. "It is lowering to our pride." They were his dogs snapping at him, but, tragic figure though he had become, He scarcely heeded them. Against such fearful evidence, it was not their belief in him that he needed, it was his own. He felt his ego slipping from him. "Don't desert me, bully," he whispered hoarsely to it. In his dark nature there was a touch of the feminine, as in all the great pirates, and it sometimes gave him intuitions. Suddenly he tried the guessing game. "Hook," he called, "have you another voice?" Now Peter could never resist a game, and he answered blithely in his own voice, "I have." "And another name?" "Aye, aye." "Vegetable?" asked Hook. "No." "Mineral?" "No." "Animal?" "Yes." "Man?" "No." This answer rang out scornfully. "Boy?" "Yes." "Ordinary boy?" "No." "Wonderful boy?" To Wendy's pain, the answer that rang out this time was, "Yes." "Are you in England?" "No." "Are you here?" "Yes." Hook was completely puzzled. "You ask him some questions," he said to the others, wiping his damp brow. Smee reflected. "I can't think of a thing," he said regretfully. "Can't guess," crowed Peter. "Do you give it up?" Of course, in his pride, he was carrying the game too far, and the miscreants saw their chance. "Yes, yes," they answered eagerly. "Well then," he cried, "I am Peter Pan." Pan. In a moment, Hook was himself again, and Smee and Starkey were his faithful henchmen. "Now we have him," Hook shouted. "Into the water, Smee! Starkey, mind the boat! Take him, dead or alive!" He leaped as he spoke, and simultaneously came the gay voice of Peter. "Are you ready, boys?" "Aye, aye!" from various parts of the lagoon. "Then lam into the pirates!" The fight was short and sharp. First to draw blood was John, who gallantly climbed into the boat and held Starkey. There was fierce struggle, in which the cutlass was torn from the pirate's grasp. He wriggled overboard, and John leapt after him. The dinghy drifted away. Here and there a head bobbed up in the water, and there was a flash of steel, followed by a cry or a whoop. In the confusion some struck at their own side. The corkscrew of Smee got Toodles in the fourth rib, but he was himself pinked in turn by Curly. Further up the rock, Starkey was pressing slightly, and the twins hard. Where all this time was Peter? He was seeking bigger game. The others were all brave boys, and they must not be blamed for backing from the pirate captain. His iron claw made a circle of dead water round him, from which they fled like affrighted fishes. But there was one who did not fear him. There was one prepared to enter that circle. Strangely, it was not in the water that they met. Hook rose to the rock to breathe, and at the same moment Peter scaled it on the opposite side. The rock was slippery as a ball, and they had to crawl rather than climb. Neither knew that the other was coming. Each, feeling for a grip, met the other's arm. In surprise, they raised their heads. Their faces were almost touching. So they met. Some of the greatest heroes have confessed that just before they fell to, they had a sinking. Had it been so with Peter at that moment, I would admit it. After all, he was the only man that the sea cook had feared. But Peter had no sinking. He had one feeling only, gladness, and he gnashed his pretty teeth with joy. Quick as thought, he snatched a knife from Hook's belt, and was about to drive it home, when he saw that he was higher up the rock than his foe. It would not have been fighting fair. He gave the pirate a hand to help him up. It was then that Hook bit him. Not the pain of this, but its unfairness was what dazed Peter. It made him quite helpless. He could only stare, horrified. Every child is affected thus the first time he is treated unfairly. All he thinks he has a right to when he comes to you to be yours is fairness. After you have been unfair to him, he will love you again, but will never afterwards be quite the same boy. No one ever gets over the first unfairness. No one except Peter. He often met it, but he always forgot it. I suppose that was the real difference between him and all the rest. So when he met it now, it was like the first time, and he could just stare, helpless. Twice the iron hand clawed him. A few moments afterwards, the other boys saw Hook in the water, striking wildly for the ship. No elation on the pestilent face now, only white fear, for the crocodile was in dogged pursuit of him. On ordinary occasions, the boys would have swum alongside cheering, but now they were uneasy, for they had lost both Peter and Wendy, and were scouring the lagoon for them, calling them by name. They found the dinghy and went home in it, shouting, "Peter! Wendy!" as they went, but no answer came, save mocking laughter from the mermaids. They must be swimming back, or flying, the boys concluded. They were not very anxious, because they had such faith in Peter. They chuckled, boy-like, because they would be late for bed, and it was all Mother Wendy's fault. When their voices died away, there came cold silence over the lagoon, and then a feeble cry. "Help! Help!" Two small figures were beating against the rock. The girl had fainted and lay on the boy's arm. With a last effort, Peter pulled her up the rock and then lay down beside her. Even as he also fainted, he saw that the water was rising. He knew that they would soon be drowned, but he could do no more. As they lay side by side, a mermaid caught Wendy by the feet and began pulling her softly into the water. Peter, feeling her slip from him, woke with a start and was just in time to draw her back. But he had to tell her the truth. "We're on the rock, Wendy," he said, "but it is growing smaller. Soon the water will be over it." She did not understand even now. "We must go," she said, almost brightly. "Yes," he answered faintly. "Shall we swim or fly, Peter?" He had to tell her. "Do you think you could swim or fly as far as the island, Wendy, without my help?" She had to admit that she was too tired. He moaned. "What is it?" she asked, anxious about him at once. "I can't help you, Wendy. Hook wounded me. I can neither fly nor swim." "Do you mean we shall both be drowned?" "Look how the water's rising." They put their hands over their eyes to shut out the sight. They thought they would soon be no more. As they sat thus, something brushed against Peter as light as a kiss, and stayed there, as if saying timidly, "Can I be of any use?" It was the tail of a kite, which Michael had made some days before. It had torn itself out of his hand and floated away. "Michael's kite," Peter said without interest. But next moment he had seized the tail and was pulling the kite toward him. "It lifted Michael off the ground," he cried. "Why should it not carry you?" "Both of us." "It can't lift two." Michael and Curly tried. "Let us draw lots," Wendy said bravely. "And you a lady? Never." Already he had tied the tail round her. She clung to him. She refused to go without him. But with a "Goodbye, Wendy," he pushed her from the rock, and in a few minutes she was borne out of his sight. Peter was alone on the lagoon. The rock was very small now. Soon it would be submerged. Pale rays of light tiptoed across the waters, and by there was to be heard a sound at once the most musical and the most melancholy in the world, the mermaids calling to the moon. Peter was not quite like other boys, but he was afraid at last. A tremor ran through him, like a shudder passing over the sea. But on the sea one shudder follows another till there are hundreds of them, and Peter felt just the one. Next moment he was standing erect on the rock again, with that smile on his face and a drum beating within him. It was saying, "To die will be an awfully big adventure."
End of Chapter 8.